I'm Lavra, 34, and if I'm honest, most of my life has felt like living backstage while my sister Rachel performed under a relentless, flattering spotlight. I learned early how to be quiet, how to hold my breath when attention swept past me, and how to build an inner world where I didn't have to ask for applause to feel whole. What no one in my family realized, what I carefully kept folded and tucked away like a secret letter, was that through years of quiet discipline, long nights, spreadsheets lit by a single lamp, and a stubborn faith in compounding returns, I built a fortune of over $8 million. It was never about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about building a life where no one's neglect could tip me over. And then last Thanksgiving, Rachel found out. She found the numbers I'd never planned to show, and she detonated at the dinner table like a firework in a library. My father's face drained. My mother froze mid-motion with the pie server hovering over a pumpkin ridge. Cousins stiffened in their chairs. And I sat there very still, the way you sit still when a glass teeters on the edge, and you hope stillness will keep it from shattering. Everything you need to know about my childhood fits into a single image. Rachel in front of a lens and me at the edge of the frame. Half turned, half cropped, half remembered. We grew up outside St. Louis on a street that hummed with sprinklers in the summer and squeaked with boots in the winter. Rachel, 2 years older, had a way of arriving in every room as if the room had been waiting for her. My parents adored that about her. They adored her recitals, her poetry readings, her costume fittings, her loud laugh that made strangers smile. My father always seemed to be reaching for his wallet or his car keys. My mother always had a comb, a plan, a bouquet. When I brought home a ribbon from the science fair, it lay on the kitchen counter until it was buried under mail. When Rachel brought home a medal, my dad hung it that night under the light that made brass glow. Birthdays told the same story with different frosting. Rachel's parties had themes: enchanted forests, roaring 20s, Paris at night. Invitations were hand-lettered. Cupcakes were tiny sugar flowers. There was always a professional photographer who told us where to stand. And when we got the pictures back, Rachel's smile was full page, editorial, perfect. My birthdays were dinner and a store-bought cake and a candle that bent because we'd kept it in a drawer. One year they forgot until I said, "Isn't today the day?" And my mother touched her chest and said, "Oh, Lavra," with a guilt that vanished by noon. I want to be fair. My parents didn't wake up and decide to love one child more. They gravitated to what they understood. Rachel was loud, legible, and immediate. I was subtle, careful, and best appreciated on a second read. It's not an excuse, but understanding it helped keep the bitterness from calcifying inside me. The one person who read me on the first try was my grandmother, my father's mother, whose hands were gentle and whose opinions were not. She noticed things, the way I lined my pencils by length, the way I watched prices at the grocery store, the way some kids watch clouds. She'd lean in and tell me stories about growing up as a middle child who learned to make herself a quiet fortress. Sometimes the flowers that grow in the shade knot their roots so deep the wind can't touch them, she'd say, smoothing my hair. "You will do well, Lara, because you know how to wait." Waiting is a form of strength most people never practice. She introduced me to the idea that money could be a form of oxygen if you used it right. She gave me $20 and took me to the bank where the carpet was too soft, and we opened a savings account with a teller who spoke as if each word had 2 decimal places. I wrote my first deposit in a tiny notebook and watched interest bloom like lichen, slow, quiet, inevitable. It felt like a secret garden I could tend even when no one else noticed I was there. In high school, while Rachel collected audiences, I collected ledgers. I tracked babysitting income, grocery store bagging shifts, the $15 prize from a math contest, and the $5 bill my neighbor pressed into my palm after I reset her Wi-Fi. The numbers made me feel steady. Numbers didn't glance at you and forget. They sat still on the page, true as gravity. I learned frugality like a language how to buy textbooks used, how to mend a hem, how to cook a week's worth of meals for the cost of one restaurant lunch. By senior year, I had enough saved to feel the faint hum of independence under my feet. College acceptance letters arrived in thick envelopes that thumped onto the doormat, and my parents were busy ferrying Rachel to a rehearsal and a tearful breakup and a celebratory dinner for a poem that got published in a local magazine. I opened my letter in my room, read the word congratulations 3 times, and sat down on the floor because the future had just opened and it was wide in mine. A partial scholarship for finance, a campus with red brick buildings, and a library that looked like a ship with its prow pointed at tomorrow. When I left for college, there wasn't a banner, but I had a car with a dented door and a coffee thermos and a feeling like a kite string unspooling into blue. Freedom has a sound when you've been quiet your whole life. It's the sound of your own footsteps and the confidence that they're headed somewhere only you can see. College reshaped me. There, I wasn't anyone's younger anything. I was the person who sat in the front row because I liked hearing ideas at full volume, who stayed late in the computer lab because the simulation models felt like games where the score mattered, who kept a spreadsheet for everything: hours, expenses, hypotheses, outcomes. I double majored in finance and economics because I liked understanding how tides move boats and boats move markets and markets move lives. I worked mornings at a coffee shop and nights at the library and weekends doing books for a florist who paid me in part cash and part dahlias. I lived in an apartment where the walls were thin and the rent was thinner, shared a bedroom with a friend who taught me to laugh loudly, and learned I could be broke and not feel poor. Every dollar had a job, and every job had a reason, and the reasons stacked like bricks. While I was assembling a foundation, Rachel was trying on lives like dresses. She made it 1.5 years into college and then announced that academia was suffocating her genius. She moved to the city with help from my parents and tried photography, then screenwriting, then interior design. Each passion was expensive and ephemeral, like a sparkler in the rain. My parents bought cameras and laptops and a drafting table that cost more than my car. At Thanksgiving, conversation circled Rachel's latest project like a parade, and I sat there, content and invisible, eating my mashed potatoes and thinking about balance sheets. I met a professor who changed everything by not making a big deal of it. Dr. Abbott was a former analyst with a face, like a hawk and a habit of asking one more question than you wanted to answer. He pushed me into investment competitions and let me use software that hummed with market data. "You're good at this," he said once, as if noting the weather. "You see risk the way a chess player sees boards." Patience is a strategy, not a personality trait. After graduation, when people in suits marched toward big names on big streets, I went to a boutique firm called Northwood Capital that had 3 conference rooms, 5 big whiteboards, and an appetite for emerging markets. The salary was fine, the bonuses were possible, and the learning was nonstop. I rented a small studio with a window that let me watch the city breathe, and I kept my old car because it worked. I saved 60% of what I made because I could, because the numbers proved it would matter, because every future I wanted required present tense restraint. The thing about living below your means when you're surrounded by people, sprinting past theirs, is that no one throws you a parade for saying no. They ask why you don't say yes more. Colleagues invited me to dinners that cost as much as my grocery budget. I declined and went home to lentils and annual reports. Weekends blurred into research. I learned to love the feeling of finding something slightly undervalued and slightly inevitable. The first time a thesis of mine paid off in triple digits, it felt less like luck and more like a door opening to a room I'd been standing outside for years. I reinvested and pretended nothing had happened. My family and I remained in each other's orbits, but at a distance. Holidays were a ritual with a script, Rachel dramatic and adored, me polite and peripheral, my father trying to keep peace, my mother planning a centerpiece and a compliment for Rachel's hair. The few times anyone asked about my work, the question was vague, like someone squinting at a far-off street sign. So you do, what is it, accounting? My mother would say, and I'd say, something like that, because accuracy did not matter there. I built a different kind of family in the meantime. My college roommate, Maya, became a corporate attorney who taught me the difference between winning and not losing. My colleague, Jerome, and his husband, Ellis, adopted a dog that adored me and insisted I be godmother in all but name. My neighbor, Mrs. Pina, fed me soap at a video and made sure I never treated holidays like regular Thursdays. In their company, I didn't feel the need to say, look at me, because they already were, without any prompting. By 30, I had crossed into seven figures. There were no balloons. I sat at my desk and looked at the screen where the zeros lined up like a choir, and I put my hand over my chest because some successes don't feel triumphant so much as vindicating. A year later, my grandmother died, and the sound of my father's voice telling me the news traveled through the phone like a cold wind. At the reading of her will, my mother made a tight comment about how curious it was that Gran left me $50,000. I didn't say what I was thinking, that my grandmother had always seen me, and this was one last way of saying, I trust your stewardship. I invested it. I didn't buy a new car, or a watch with a dark face and a whispering second hand, or a plane ticket to anywhere. I put it into 3 companies I believed in, one working on grid-scale batteries, one rethinking medical imaging, one building infrastructure for cross-border payments in places no one on the morning shows ever talked about. 2 were acquired. 1 went public and then doubled. The 50 became 800 without asking permission to do so. I bought a house after that. Not the house that announces itself from the curb, not the one with glass balustrades and a door that looks like art, but a craftsman with a wraparound porch and a yard that caught morning light. I paid cash because the numbers said I could, and because sitting in a house you own outright is like sitting in your own spine. Strong, unbendable years. When my mother visited, she said, nice little place, and then, why didn't you pick a building with amenities? Rachel's friend lives in a tower with a rooftop cinema. I poured her tea and nodded and said nothing about deeds. I liked the quiet. I liked the way the floorboards creaked on cold nights, and the way light moved across the bookshelves, and the fact that my kitchen didn't judge me for eating pasta over the sink when I was tired. This is where I tell you that money didn't fix the ache of not being seen, but it did something almost as good. It gave me choices that didn't depend on being chosen. I set up an anonymous scholarship at my old university for students who were clearly brilliant and clearly overlooked, the ones who remind you of long shadows and deep roots. I wrote checks to programs that taught financial literacy to kids who'd never been, taught that interest could be a friend instead of a vampire. I funded a research grant for a lab working on a rare disease that had touched someone I love. No one thanked me by name. That anonymity felt like a moral exfoliation, like I rubbed off whatever residue of see me. See me was still clinging from childhood. Then came Thanksgiving. There's always a hinge moment where life swings open to a new topology, and mine swung on a 4th Thursday in November. The smell of cinnamon and the sound of plates crossing a table. I almost didn't go. Work was heavy. My peace was real. But some magnetism tugged curiosity, obligation, a desire to test whether the old script was still the only script. The day before, Rachel called to confirm something trivial and then told me, thrilled, that our parents had helped her buy a BMW. Payments are rough, but they insisted she said with a laugh that invited applause. Not everyone can afford the good life on a bookkeeper's salary, she added, mistaking my job as usual, shrinking my world to fit her idea of it. I drove the next morning in my reliable car with a clean interior and a radio that sometimes forgot to cooperate. My parents' driveway was occupied by something glossy and white. The metaphor wrote itself. I parked on the street and walked up the path that had felt very long when I was small and still felt long because memory stretches what time can't. My mother hugged me quickly, don't wrinkle the blouse, and called over her shoulder, Rachel, your sister's here, as if that were my most notable credential. My father hugged me properly, the way he does when he remembers to be just my dad and not the mediator of every vibe in the room. Rachel lounged on the sofa like a cat in a sunny window. Her husband, Kyle, was between opportunities and very confident about them. He smiled the way people smile when they've prepped a line. How's the market, Laura? Still pushing numbers around for other people? I thought about the portfolios I manage, the entrepreneurs I back, the balance of caution and conviction I live inside. And I said, busy. In the guest room, I set my overnight bag down and took a breath. The room smelled like lavender and dust, like childhood and Febreze. I slipped my planner into the side pocket of my tote habit and then paused. Something fell off. The tote wasn't where I'd left it. The zipper tab angled wrong. I told myself not to rehearse paranoia, and then I opened it anyway. The planner's papers had shifted. I knew the weight of my own pages the way a musician knows a chord by feel. There, tucked in the inside flap, was the summary from a meeting with my advisor. Allocations, projected returns, net worth to the dollar. I slid the papers deeper into the pocket and stood in the quiet room, listening to my pulse. In the kitchen, there were yams that would sweeten and green beans that would crisp, and a bird that would sucker the table with gravy. I washed my hands and joined my mother at the stove. Conversation meandered through safe neighborhoods, recipes, and weather. Who brought what? Which cousin was allergic to which nut? Rachel drifted in and out, dropping barbed questions into the pot like bay leaves. So, do you have, fancy clients now, Laura? People with real money, not just spreadsheets? Clients vary, I said, tasting the potatoes. Do they invite you to those events with sushi on walls? I mostly raid, I said, because it was true and because it turned out not to be the right answer if what someone wants is spectacle. The table was set beautifully in my mother's domain. Silver polished until it considered its own reflection, napkins tinted like dignified swans, a centerpiece of leaves and small pumpkins that looked like someone had ordered autumn from a catalog and it had arrived on time. We held hands for a prayer. We went around and said what we were thankful for. We performed the family we almost were. When it was my turn, I said, stability and growth, because those are the words that make sense to me. And my mother nodded like I'd spoken in a foreign language she'd heard once. Rachel said she was thankful for parents who always believed in her. And she looked at me as if to say some people get it and some people don't. We ate. We passed bowls like they were peace treaties. The cousins told stories about toddlers and promotions. The aunts exchanged casserole intel. And then Rachel put down her fork with a sound that called the room to attention, and she smiled a smile with knives in it. Lavra, she said, when exactly were you planning to tell your family about your $8 million? Silence arrived and sat down at the table like a 13th guest. My father's fork slid, chimed against his plate, and rested. My mother held the pie server like it was a torch that needed carrying. I didn't move because movement seemed like it might tip something. Excuse me? I said, even though I knew exactly what she'd seen and where, and her eyes glittered with a triumph that had nothing to do with gratitude. She took a folded paper from her pocket, and I knew the crease because it was mine. She had copied the page and brought it here like a trophy. She flicked it across the table. It landed near the cranberry sauce and began to drink it in. $8 million, she said, spacing the words. All this time, pretending to be frugal, pretending to be, I don't know, humble, living in a little house, driving that car, giving me lectures about budgeting while she gestured at the numbers as if they were obscene. My mother found her voice and used it to defend a past that had just evaporated. Rachel, don't be ridiculous. Laura wouldn't. She would, Rachel snapped. She did. She's been hoarding money while we've struggled. Where was she when you took a second mortgage to help us with the down payment? Where was she when I needed a reliable car to get to work? She stood, and the wine went with her, a red arc down the white cloth. Kyle pushed back his chair, ready to be a chorus. Seems like someone let success go to her head, he said, and I nearly laughed because success had lodged itself in my bones like a quiet anchor, and my head had stayed very, very clear. I looked at my father. He had picked up the paper and was reading it not like a man surprised by numbers, but like a man who had just realized there was a whole second book to a story he thought he knew. Is this true? He asked softly, and the room felt like inhaling. Yes, I said, because the time for no's had passed. Rachel's voice climbed a ladder. What kind of person hides money from family? What kind of sister watches her parents cut checks every month and says nothing? Are you a criminal? Is that it? What did you do to get this? She was crying makeup into her wrists. I sat still. Anger rose and settled, like a tide that knows the moon is indifferent to it. When she finally ran out of words, I spoke in a voice I use for negotiations where no one can afford to flinch. I did not do anything illegal. I worked hard for 15 years. I lived beneath my means. I invested early and often and with a thesis. I compounded wins and learned from losses. I owe you an apology for the secrecy, not for the success. She made a sound like disgust and stormed down the hall, Kyle in her wake, and the front door opened and closed with the finality of a book whose spine is cracked, but whose story is not finished. The silence after a scene is a living thing. It padded around that dining room, sniffing at chairs, examining each of us. My cousins stared down at their plates as if answers might be carved in turkey. My aunt reached for a napkin and then put it back, as if she'd forgotten what hands were for. My father looked at me, then at my mother, then at the paper, then at me again. We didn't know, he said, and it sounded like confessing. No one asked, I said, and it sounded like history. My mother began clearing plates movement as a balm for feelings she didn't want to hold. One by one, relatives approached. My great-aunt patted my arm and said, "Your grandmother would be proud." My uncle, who speaks in baseball, said, "You knocked it out of the park," and I smiled because metaphors were easier than emotions right then. In the kitchen, the three of us stood among pots that still held warmth and dishes that had given theirs away. My mother didn't look at me. "You made us look like fools," she said to the sink. "You made assumptions," I said gently, because I have learned that some truths are scalpel sharp and must be laid down carefully. "You've always been so private," she went on. "We thought you didn't need you," I said, finishing the sentence she couldn't manage. But I did. Just not in the way you're used to giving. My father sat and exhaled and looked older and more awake than I'd ever seen him. "We poured ourselves into Rachel because she was a constant emergency," he said. "We told ourselves you were fine because you didn't pull on our sleeves. We told ourselves that so often it became the entire story." "I know," I said. "Knowing doesn't undo the ache, but it explains its shape." He stood, walked out, and returned with a small wooden box. "Your grandmother gave me this," he said, "and told me to give it to you when the time was right. I think I missed the right time, but I hope this one will do." Inside lay her emerald ring, cool and green as a forest, and a letter in a hand that knew how to cross T's with conviction. I read as if her voice had come back for one more conversation. She wrote about watching me choose patience over spectacle, about knowing the value of quiet, about trusting me to build a life that didn't need to be defended. Tears, inevitable in private, stood and did not fall. She knew I managed. She always did, my father said, and he was crying now, the kind of crying that doesn't ask for attention but arrives anyway. The front door opened. Rachel had returned. The makeup streaks were gone. The fury had hardened. Kyle hovered behind her, unease wrapped in bravado. "We need to talk," she said, the way people say it when talk is a battlefield they plan to win. "About your responsibility to this family." "Rachel," my father began, but she cut through his tone. "No, I'm serious. Mom and Dad took on debt to help me. You can wipe it out in an afternoon. You can cover the car, the kitchen renovation, the—" "Stop," I said, not unkindly. "No." Her eyes widened like a door she hadn't considered might be locked. "No, I will not be paying your debts. I won't be taking on Mom and Dad's mortgage either. I love you." "I love them." "Love and funding are not synonyms." She laughed, a sharp sound that hoped to wound. "Typical, arrogant. You just want to lord this over us. Do you think I wanted any of this attention?" I asked and gestured at the table where dessert sweated under domes of plastic wrap. "I built a quiet life because quiet felt safe. I kept my finances private because I didn't want money to be the only language anyone spoke to me in. I'm not lording. I'm drawing a boundary." Kyle tried another angle. "Family takes care of family," he said. "We agree," I replied. "I've taken care of myself so you didn't have to." "That counts." My father stepped into a role I'd never seen him occupy. He stood between us without blocking anyone and said, calm as a metronome, "Your sister owes us nothing. If anything, we owe her attention we denied and respect we misplaced." Rachel looked astonished, then betrayed, then unmoored. "You're taking her side," she said, as if sides were physics and not choices. "We're acknowledging reality," he said, "and resetting expectations." That night, I drove home under a sky full of the sort of stars you can't see if you're crying. I wasn't. I was feeling the way you feel after a bone is set, tender but relieved. In the weeks that followed, my phone learned new rhythms. Rachel texted demands that softened into appeals, that hardened to accusations, and then fell silent when my answers stayed the same. My mother floated compromises like trial balloons. "What if you helped with just the car?" And watched them drift away on my no. My father asked if I would meet him for coffee. He arrived with a notebook, a pen, and humility. "Explain ETFs again?" he said, and I drew boxes and arrows on a napkin and felt something unknot between us. Those coffees stitched themselves into a new timeline where we talked about asset allocation and also about regret, about the season when he and my mother nearly divorced because the house was vibrating with Rachel's needs, about how he mistook my competence for indifference. "We failed you," he said once, head bowed. "We loved you, but we failed you. You loved me," I said, and I learned to love myself loudly in the quiet. That counts. When my mother found a lump in February and the word biopsy burned a hole in the calendar, everything small fell away. I drove her to appointments in a waiting room painted in hopeful blues and listened to the oncologist pronounce the words, early and treatable like blessings. My mother and I held hands like we were remembering how. In the slowness of that season, she told me things how she'd never known what to do with a child who didn't ask. How my quiet felt like criticism she couldn't articulate. How she had been proud of me in private and performative for Rachel in public, and how both choices now pinched. "I thought you didn't need me," she said in the hush of an exam room. "I needed you differently," I said, And she nodded as if the grammar of us finally made sense. Rachel, after 2 months of sparring with silence, called to say she'd found full-time work. She was defensive and prickly and very slightly proud. I congratulated her and meant it. Our conversations were careful and short. She did not apologize, and I did not expect her to. Healing isn't a speech, it's a practice. And I practiced living my life with a little more sunlight. I renovated my house, not to impress anyone, but to celebrate myself. I built a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a ladder that glides like a whispered secret. I traveled to Italy for 3 weeks and cried in front of frescoes because color can be devotion. I replaced clothes that were working too hard with ones that fit and lasted and felt like quiet luxury linen that softened with time, leather that remembered my hands. Most of all, I formalized the work I had started when I was hiding. I founded the Eleanor Foundation in my grandmother's name to find the students like me sharp, overlooked, allergic to spectacle, and give them not just tuition but mentors, internships, and a community that sees them first and their output second. At the launch, I wore the emerald ring and spoke about deep roots. My father, in the front row, took notes the way he does now, diligently, like loving is a skill you can acquire with repetition. Months passed. The ground of our family shifted by millimeters at a time. Old habits growl when you move them. They also learn to sleep in new corners. On my father's birthday, we gathered again. There was cake from a bakery that spelled his name right, and candles that didn't scream when they went out. Rachel talked about her promotion and did not sweep the room with her eyes to ensure the applause reached. My mother congratulated her and then turned to ask me about a research paper I'd been reading as if both lives required equal curiosity. Later, on the porch, the evening softened the edges of the world, and my father said, Lavra, money is one kind of wealth. The other kind is harder to chart, but better to live. Self-respect, boundaries, growth. By that measure, you're the richest person I know. I laughed and said, you're biased, and he said, I am. Finally, I don't want to pretend that everything snapped into place. It didn't. Family is an ecosystem with weather. There are hot days and storms, dry spells, and green weeks. Sometimes my mother slips and says, you don't mind, do you? You're so independent. And I remind her that independence and invisibility are not synonyms. Sometimes Rachel sends a text that reads like a baited hook, and I put my phone down and go water the herbs on my porch instead. Sometimes I look at a photo of us from years ago and feel the familiar ache of missing something I never had but still wanted. But also, sometimes my father calls to ask if a diversified bomb ladder makes sense for their timeline. And it feels like being invited to the table. Sometimes my mother sends a picture of a soup she made from my recipe, and I can taste the effort to meet me in my language. Sometimes Rachel tells me about a project she worked hard to finish and doesn't ask for anything but the dignity of being listened to. And I give it. The truth is, stepping into the light didn't scorch me. It warmed me. Quiet living is still my North Star, but I am not hiding anymore. I drive the car I want because I like how safe it feels on the highway at night. I buy fresh flowers on Thursdays because beauty that withers is still worth it. I say yes to dinners when the company feeds me and no when the bill would only leave me hungry. I keep investing in people and ideas that look like shade now but will be forests later. I keep reading. I keep learning how to ask for help in full sentences. I keep reminding myself that being overlooked taught me how to look closely at numbers, at people, at rooms where power moves in particulates you can't see unless you tilt your head just so. If you're waiting for the moral, here it is. Though it's not a moral so much as a map folded into a pocket. Sometimes you will not be seen by the people you most want to see you. Sometimes they will be too busy applauding the show they recognize to notice the quiet brilliance at the edge of the stage. Learn to notice yourself. Build a life that can hold your weight even when no one's clapping. Wealth is options. Options are oxygen. Oxygen is the breath you take when you say a steady no to the version of you that bent themselves into shapes for love. Last Thanksgiving didn't break my family. It broke an illusion. The shattering was loud and messy, and then after, there was the work of sweeping and choosing what to keep. We kept what mattered, that we love each other, that we can learn new ways to do it. That truth, spoken calmly, can sometimes change the geometry of a room where you've sat your whole life. If you felt invisible in your own house, if your success arrived to a chorus of, "Why didn't you tell us?" instead of, "Well done," if you've learned to be your own witness, then you already know. Share what you want to share with people who actually listen. Give generously in ways that align with your integrity. Let your boundaries be a kindness to yourself first. I am not Rachel's shadow and never was. I am a woman who wrote her life in the margins until the margins widened into page. I'm Lavra, 34, and I built something that cannot be taken by disbelief. My sister's spotlight never belonged to me, but the light I live in now, I made it. I make it every day when I choose patience over exhibition, when I choose clarity over performance, when I choose to be seen by the people who actually look. If this sounds like your story or a story you're inching toward, then I hope you take this with you. The greatest investment I ever made was telling myself the truth and acting like it was already expected of me. The rest, the accounts, the properties, the scholarships, the ring that catches green sun when I turn my hand, are dividends. And yes, I still sit with tea at a wooden table some mornings, open a spreadsheet, and feel that old, reliable steadiness rise in me like a tide. The numbers hum. The house settles. The day waits. I am not backstage anymore. I am precisely where I chose to stand.